India within this puzzle, simply
Sure.
because we've fared well thus far.
Sure.
I wonder if, because India looks so good in a geopolitically divided world, if things were to resolve themselves, would India start looking less attractive, because then everything else starts looking normal? What's your sense?
So I think, there is a debate, let's say, about monetary policy right now, right? Whether should go 35 or 50 or where the terminal rate is. There is this usual debate about trade-offs between growth and inflation. My guess is that that trade-off is false. And the reason why it's false is because that is not where RBI policy or macro policy more generally should be focused on right now. And I'm focusing only on macro policy, not on reforms. Should we focus on? While we are all debating about whether inflation is the problem or growth is the problem, look at what's happened to our old problem, which has always been India's Achilles heel, the twin deficits. State and central deficits probably going to hit 11.5%, 12% of GDP. But far more worrying is the fact that current account is hitting at 4% of GDP. The last time when we had this combination, it was back in 2013. There, a whisper that the Fed would tighten monetary policy created the taper tantrum. The Fed now is doing QT and is raising rates. So I think macro policies, particularly monetary policy, and clearly next year's fiscal policy or fiscal policy for the rest of the year, should not get sidetracked into worrying about growth versus inflation. That is not India's problem right now. India's problem right now is to ensure that there is macroeconomic stability, because we have reached that point where traditionally India becomes very vulnerable. When you go beyond that 2.5%, 3% of current account deficit, when you go into double digits of fiscal deficit, and as proof of the pudding, in what RBI has already intervened, $80 billion? Again, you can point to massive amounts, levels of FX reserves, but it's not the level that matters as much as the burn rate that matters. And already people are talking about, should the RBI be wasting money in defending the currency? My point is that it is macroeconomic stability that needs to govern what RBI plans to do and what the government plans to do on the fiscal policy, rather than this thing about growth inflation trade-off, which right now is sort of meaningless and probably false.
So sorry, I know I mentioned last question, but I will squeeze in just one quick more. What would you have the Reserve Bank do over the course of the next 6 months with the hypothesis that you have around what will happen around the world?
I think RBI, despite the fact that you haven't really seen very much credit growth. Credit growth in real terms is barely skating water. Nominal terms has moved up, but hasn't done very much. Regardless of that, I think that RBI needs to raise rates, and needs to raise rates probably more aggressively than they have in mind. Probably more, I believe that RBI has been talking about front-loading. I'm not exactly sure what front-loading means in this context. But I think the RBI needs to signal that they are worried about the current account. They are worried about what is happening to the fiscal deficit. And they're worried about the fact that, global financial conditions are not only have tightened, but most likely it's going to tighten further. And if euro area growth is going to weaken, whereas US growth is going to lift off or do better, and the growth differential between Fed and ECB is going to widen, then chances are that we're also going to see a further strengthening of the dollar. That's not a very good world for India. And I think that's what the RBI should do. Talk about that and therefore raise rates.